Good morning. A little while ago, I was sitting outside my favourite pub, and we were talking about the number of regulars who died suddenly quite recently, and I expressed a certain amount of unease, and one of them turned to me and said, "It's all right," he said, "the laughing lady has passed over for now." It wasn't an expression I'd heard before, but historically we have always personified death as our inevitable visitor, remorselessly lingering, sometimes merciful, not necessarily feared. In Being Mortal, a book that's caused more conversation than any I can remember for many months, the surgeon, writer and this year's Wreath lecturer, Atul Gawande, has been reflecting on how we treat the very old and how we meet our deaths in this perhaps over-medicalised world. Approaching the laughing lady from a very different direction in his The Undiscovered Country, Carl Watkins has tramped Britain, looking at how we have dealt with death through the centuries. To help our conversation, I'm also joined by Deborah Bowman, Professor of Bioethics and Medical Law at St George's, University of London, and by the writer and favourite of this programme, Diana Athill, who was born in 1917 and is not dead yet. We're going to be asking what makes a good death, and thinking about the persistence of a belief in the afterlife in the modern world. Atul, if I can begin with you. This is a book which covers all sorts of ways of death and old age, but your big theme is that we have over-medicalised death. Can you explain that to us?
Well, at the basic level, it's that we've decided that when it comes to mortality, it's to be treated like any other condition that the doctors take care of. You know, it's we went from the 1950s where most death occurred in the home to where today the 80% occurs in institutions, mostly in hospitals. And we've turned it over to people like me who actually don't know a lot about how to guide people through that final phase of their life.
Now, you say in the book, you contrast what happens in modern America, and I think modern Britain's probably very similar in this regard, with the way that your grandfather died in India. Tell us a little bit about that and why you think he had a better death than many of us face today.
So he died at 110 years old.
Good start.
He had 20 years of his life that he probably needed, around-the-clock help. He needed help bathing. He needed help dressing. He had some confusions at times, but he really was someone who nonetheless sat at the head of the table in the family home. People revered him. They came to him for business advice. They came to him for advice on marriages. And he insisted on continuing to patrol his 200 acres of land. His sons would help him. They got a smaller horse for him in order for him to be able to make it safely around the fields. It was the kind of death, aging and then death that we're nostalgic for. As it happens, he died falling off a bus. He insisted on continuing to work and hit his head.
But he was surrounded by a kind of vigorous conversational society. He was engaged in other generations the whole time, and that probably was the reason that it was such a good ending for him. Yes. Whereas most of us now will end our lives in hospital, and yet if you ask people where they want to die, very few people say hospital. So why does that happen? Why are we forced into hospitals?
Well, a couple things. It's even falling apart in India now. So the multi-generational family worked in part because it enslaved the young women who were expected to live their lives around what would happen to the grandfather or the father. But then also, imagine the sons of my grandfather who lived to 80 still waiting to inherit their land. As soon as we had
like Prince Charles here, yes.
As soon as we got pensions, we actually moved apart. The older folks did not want to live under the sons and daughters' rules. The sons and daughters didn't want to live under the parents' rules. And so we made an ideal that a good life is the healthy and independent life. But we had no plan for what happens when you're not healthy and not independent. And we said, well, guess what? Medicine will take care of that.
So in a sense, it's the selfishness of the not old pushing the old into nursing homes and then into hospitals for their own reasons that's the problem.
Well, it's a mutual selfishness. Part of what I'm implying is that, as soon as we had the economic means, as we got older, we didn't want to live with the kids and have them taking care of us either, because we suddenly had to be under their rules, and no one wanted that. What we have done is we have said that it's not a cult of the young, it's a cult of the independent self. And then when you are no longer able to fully care for yourself, we put you in institutions. It is in old age homes or in hospitals. And there we say, you know what is most important? Your safety and your health. Instead of understanding that people have priorities much larger than that, priorities besides just being safe and living longer no matter what.
Absolutely, and I want to come on to those priorities because you have done a kind of journey around the hospitals, the hospices and the nursing homes and all different kinds across America, asking what people want. And a lot of people will end up actually in a hospital bed, not the right place to die because you're surrounded by noise and other people and lots of terrible food and so forth. And we've all seen people, most of us have seen people in that situation. But we also have nursing homes, which are often rather militarised almost. You know, you're ordered around, you're told when you can eat, you're told what you can and you cannot do. So you've come across much better places for the old to be in America. Can you describe a couple of them? I'm thinking, first of all, about the one which introduces animals and children into the living space.
Yeah, completely fascinating. When people have priorities, one of those priorities is that they want to have purpose. They want to know that they're doing more than just existing. And this was a nursing home in upstate New York that they said, we're going to apply for relief from the regulations around safety to allow the nursing home residents to own their own pets. And in fact, they introduced 4 dogs, 2 cats, and 100 parakeets, and everybody was distributed. Anybody who wanted could have their own pets. It required lifting heaven and earth. It required figuring out how the nurses came to battle and the aides came to battle over who was going to clean up the dog poop on the floor because if a resident couldn't lean over to get it. But the residents who began to have something to care for, they suddenly came alive. They were not plagued by what the doctor there called the 3 plagues of boredom, loneliness, and helplessness. Their need for antidepressants, anti-anxiolytics, antipsychotics dropped, and survival actually increased.
Because a bit like your grandfather, they were surrounded by caring for other people and a kind of multi-sided world which was kind of colourful and energetic.
That's
even
right.
though it was animals, not relatives.
Correct. They had, so people have loyalties. They have things that they live for that are bigger than themselves. They may be as simple as a pet or a family. It may be as complex as wanting to contribute to a political debate or to write a book like Diana Athill or wanting to be devoted to God. People have bigger goals.
A bigger cause.
Yeah.
Diana, reading this book, and I know you've reviewed it, how does it compare to the care home that you're in at the moment?
Well, I was delighted to find out, as I read, that my care home that I'm in was almost your ideal. We don't have pets, and I think that dogs are going too far because dogs need to be taken for walks, and very few people in care homes rarely can take a dog for a proper walk. But I do think that it would be nice to be allowed parakeets. But apart from that, pretty well everything you said is available in my care home. And it was founded in 1887 by a noble lady with a lot of money and with terribly high morals. She was so religious that she never made a decision without 20 minutes of prayer. But that led her to make very good rules, that the residents were to be respected, that they were to be treated as human beings, grown-up people, not children, that they were to be given total autonomy.
You can sleep in all day if you
no
want.
one could come into their room without knocking at the door and asking their permission. All these things. And she laid down these rules, and they've been obeyed to this day. And it's another thing about it is, for old people in a home, the one important thing, it's not the heating or the looks of the place or anything, it is the staff. And you need to have intelligent and kind people. And I said to my people, how do you get so many wonderful, loving people working here? And she said, well, perhaps when a vacancy comes, I may interview 20 people before I find the right one.
But they must also be paying and offering the kind of working environment that people want to be part of.
They don't only respect the residents, they respect their staff. The staff get proper holidays, good pay, good conditions.
And there are lots of good care homes around the country, of course. And Diana, what do you most want? Do you want autonomy for yourself, be able to shape your own days? Is that the thing that's most important?
You want autonomy. You want to have a feeling that your room is your room. And in fact, ours are. We furnish them ourselves. There's nothing in the room that isn't ours. You want to come and go as you wish, but then there's this lovely, lovely feeling that you have no tiresome, boring duties. You can sit back. The first...
If you wanted to sit in your room all day drinking malt whiskey, you'd be allowed to do that, yes.
And for the 3 weeks in, something went wrong with my shower. And panic struck. I thought, oh, God, I haven't got a local plumber. What do? I must find a Yellow Pages. Wait, I don't have to find a Yellow Pages. I say, Bob, my shower's gone wrong. Someone comes and puts it right.
The fascinating thing, Diana, is that many of the people I interviewed who lived in nursing homes, you would meet with them, and the first thing they would say is, when do I get to go home? Whereas you're in a place that you genuinely feel is your home.
It is my home, and it began to feel like my home very quickly, because I had all my own things with me.
Deborah, I was going to ask you, how problematic is the law in all of this? Because lots of people want autonomy, and lots of nursing homes would say, well, we have legal obligations to the safety of our patients. You know, we can't let them do this, we can't let them do that for fear of being sued. And that is a huge issue now, isn't it?
I don't know. I don't know whether it is as huge an issue as we...
Or is it a huge excuse?
I'm not sure it's an excuse. I think it might be a misunderstanding. There's definitely a tension. So you've got laws on the one hand that say everybody has the right to be involved in their own care, no decision about me without me, etc. But you also do have a system of scrutiny and surveillance. And as I was listening, I was thinking, you know, it's so interesting that actually it's not about autonomy or paternalism. It's about meaningful autonomy in an environment that actually isn't about surveillance and regulation, but is about care. Really basic things. And I'm not sure there's anything in the law to prevent care. What I do think is that if you are short-staffed and you're worrying about the next CQC inspection, for very good reasons, you're
Care
less
Quality
likely...
Commission.
Yes, sorry, I'm sorry,
Yeah,
Care
that's right.
Quality Commission. You know, care is perhaps one of the first things to go if you haven't got time, if you haven't got support, if what you're doing isn't valued. So it's not that the law prevents that, but I think there is a real challenge, a tension, if you like, between this idea of surveillance and meaningful autonomy.
Atul, I'm very interested in all the places you went round in America. A lot of them were like Diana's home, run by charities and non-state organisations of one kind or another. You probably don't know quite as much about this country as America, but to what extent is this a money problem?
I think that there is a money problem, but it rests in a funny place that I didn't expect. It rests in the adult children of the parents, because these homes market themselves, nonprofit and for-profit, ultimately to the children of the adults, because many of the older people will defer the decision about where they're going to end up to those younger people. And one person said to me, you know, when one person put it beautifully, they said that the children come in, they want safety. Safety is what we want for those we love, but autonomy is what we want for ourselves. So they come into these homes and they make sure, is this safe? Are they going to have trouble with falls? But they ask very little about how lonely are people. Do they get to stay connected to their friends? Can they still go to the same church that they used to go to?
So if there's one message coming out of this programme for people listening at the moment, is think very, very hard about the environment you're going to put your older relatives into and what they want, not what you want.
That's correct. I think the rules allow plenty of room for the homes to be designed in the way that Diana gets to experience. She's in a home that has made sure that they're serving the needs of those people who live there, not necessarily the relatives who might scream if they eat some non-pureed food.
Right, now I'm going to turn to Carl Watkins now for a historical view of all of this, because, Carl, your book, The Undiscovered Country, looks at rituals of death in Britain going back many, many hundreds of years. But one of the things that is absolutely obvious as a big difference to today's world is that in the previous generations, people saw the very old and they saw death happening all around them. Death happened inside the house, in the front room. It wasn't something that people were remote from people's lives. Fair?
Yes, I think that's right. People in these past centuries are exposed to a much greater extent to death than we are in the modern age. Though interestingly, they're also keen to try and push it away. And they might watch others die, but they struggle very often to comprehend the death of the self. And so you see in these earlier centuries a battery of teaching on the part of the church designed to shake people out of that kind of complacency and to make them focus on their own death.
And just so we can visualise this more, there's a guy called John Barrett who occupies a fascinating chapter in your book. Tell us about John Barrett. He was a well-to-do but slightly guilty merchant. Yes,
John Barrett's a rich merchant from Bury St Edmunds in the second half of the 15th century. And he has things on his conscience, as a rich merchant will in late medieval England. And so he prepares very carefully for his own death. He prepares his tomb, which is an elaborately sculpted cadaver tomb depicting him as he will look when he eventually dies. And
you can still see it, and it's pretty grim.
You can still see it, but also he plans the way in which he'll be remembered after death in cycles of prayer, which are aimed not simply at keeping him in mind, but also pushing his soul through the fires of purgatory and smoothing his way to salvation. So there are very real reasons here why individuals in the Middle Ages need to think about their end.
That is a very, very big issue for all of us now, isn't it, of course, Diana? What do you think is going to happen?
I came across the other day, I was horrified. A man who was related to me, was quite old, has lived a very, very useful and, as far as I know, blameless life, certainly devoted to his family, I would have thought, nothing heavy on his conscience. I went to see him, having been told that he was dying, and he said to me, "Diana, I'm so frightened of dying." I said, "Why are you frightened of dying?" I mean, I was horrified. We all die. I mean, what is... And he said, "What's going to happen to me afterwards?" And I didn't know what to say, because I wanted to say, "Well, darling, you won't be there. You don't have to worry. You won't know. You'll cease to exist." And I thought that might frighten him even more badly.
It's non-existence that's the terrifying
thing. But
you
see,
isn't it?
he was as frightened as any medieval person about what was going to happen to him afterwards, which had never occurred to me.
Well, Britain is often said to be the most secular society at the moment in the world, and yet this programme does its research, and we've looked at a longitudinal study of people born in 1970, which reveals that about 30% of people believe in God, but almost 50% of people believe in the afterlife. So the belief in the afterlife carries on, it hangs on very persistently, and always has done, I think, hasn't it?
I think so. In the past, there was a much stronger sense of what the afterlife constitutes it, a much clearer sense of...
There was purgatory.
There was purgatory in the Middle Ages. That's abolished at the Reformation, but heaven and hell remain as places that can be imagined in material terms. The materiality of hellfire is something that lingers on well into the 19th century, beyond the 19th century. But through the 20th century, we see a steady thinning out of visions of what the afterlife constitutes. It becomes a place of reunion, a place of commingling of spirits.
Blander, a little bit of gentle classical music in the background.
Blander, more remote, more undiscovered.
Yes, absolutely.
Moving more and more to the idea that it's just going to be very peaceful and that you aren't going to like being asleep and you'll never know.
One of the really interesting themes that comes out of Carl's book is how important it was socially that there was some awful punishment waiting, that people thought that if you didn't have the fires of hell or the fires of purgatory ahead of you, society would just fall apart. And later in the book you have this character, Charles Bradlaugh, very well known in British politics, as one of the early atheists. But when he decides he is an atheist, it's almost impossible to survive in society because that is regarded as such a threat to the established order. Once you believe in atheism, once you think there's nothing after death, then the whole social order will fall to pieces.
Yet even Gladstone thought that if you dissolved hell's terrors, then the social fabric would begin to collapse.
Partly because the poor wouldn't carry on working and coping with being poor. It's interesting. There would have been some kind of social upheaval. So we go through this huge change when suddenly the fires of hell are doused, the afterlife becomes much blander, and there's only one real group of people whose death we still focus on, and that's those who die in battle. And you've got a chapter about the glorious dead and the cenotaph and the unknown warrior. And I'd say even today, thinking of those coffins coming back through Wootton Bassett, if you're killed in Afghanistan, if you're killed in Iraq, the country still focuses on your death. In any other circumstance, they don't. Why do you think that is?
Clearly, we have a culture of commemoration that's powerfully shaped by the events of the First World War and then the Second World War, and that informs the way in which we think about military casualties.
This is a Poppy Week, of course, yes.
Absolutely. But I think the other thing is that the young people who go out to Iraq and then to Afghanistan and are killed there stand for something that's rather unusual in our society, which is a group of people who die young. We're not used to people dying young now in a way that previous generations perhaps were. And so we see in this sacrifice something that is heightened, that is alien and unfamiliar to us.
Absolutely. Deborah, I want to come on to some of the things that you've been writing about. You look at death, obviously, from the legal and medical point of view, but you've also been out researching the ways that people are thinking about death in this more secular age. And one of the strange things you've come across are death cafes.
Yes, I'm not sure I would describe them as very strange. They sound strange.
They do sound strange.
But they are not strange, actually, when you go to them. They are facilitated conversations without an agenda at which anybody is welcome in a local community. So it might take place in a library, it might take place in a tea shop, someone's home. And the only brief for the session is that you will talk about death over cups of tea and lots of cake. And so there is this coalescence, if you like, of thinking about this most frightening thing in a very informal and very almost nurturing environment.
I love the British assumption that cake solves everything, which of course it does.
But actually, I think it's really important. The ritual of sharing food and drink with people in a very open, facilitative, led by the group way. So you're not expected to discuss anything you don't want to. And people have real, meaningful conversations about what they're frightened of, about what they think about death, about what they would like to happen. Because very often we say things like, I don't want to die in hospital, but we say nothing more about that. What does that even mean? And these are places, non-medicalised, non-institutionalised places where people talk about death and dying.
And this was started simply because somebody noticed that in this society we don't talk about death, that we need to, and they wanted to create a place where that could happen.
Yes, I mean, it has its roots in a French ethnographer, actually, who became very interested in the ways people did and didn't talk about death, and thought that there was space for communities and individuals to talk about death. And they're very much a UK thing, but they've spread to North America, they've spread all over the place.
How does one get to the news?
They have a wonderful website, and you simply put in your postcode and you can find where death cafes happen near you. If you want to have a death cafe, there are instructions on how to go about hosting it, etc.
It's brilliant.
They are
brilliant.
Wonderful.
But I think that what people ought to be, people ought to be taught at school without thinking about death. Because I think that's why I'm not frightened about death. Because someone, when I was very young, told me that Montaigne had said, everybody ought to think about death for 15 minutes every day or something. And I thought, what a sensible thing. And I did think about death very often.
Yes.
And it said to me, very obvious after a bit, that it's something that happens to everybody, everything. You begin life, you live it, you go over the hump, you die. The next life begins. It is a part of life. And once I'd seen that, I stopped being frightened.
There's something very containing about that, talking about it.
Atul, you've talked to an awful lot of people in America who are about to die in different circumstances. Did you think that in America, too, there is a lack of a proper conversation about death, or do you think that people talk about it more in these institutions you've been describing?
Oh, I think it's the same picture. And in fact, I interviewed people even in India and other parts of the world. And what's interesting is that as economies improve, so in the cities in India, you're starting to see that they also are hospitalizing people at the end of life. And I think this phenomenon of the death cafe, and even the fact that when I'm doing my lectures and readings around this book, half of the audience I'm finding are under the age of 35. We don't have any experience with that phase of our life. I was struck that it was only when I was in medical school that was the first time I saw anybody die. And first time I'd seen a dead body, first time I experienced it, felt the touch of the skin of a dead person. This was a remarkable change in just a generation and a half, 2 generations. This was a very normal experience in 1950 in a way that it is not now. It engenders great fright what happens, not just towards the end, but with this idea that as you become, Carl pointed out that we no longer have to fear for 60, 70 years of our life that we might be mortal. We can live as if we're immortal.
As if we're not.
And as a consequence, we come to think that later phase of our life must be miserable and must be terrible. And we miss out on the fact that actually studies show, good research shows, that people become happier, have less anxiety, lower levels of depression, even as they become less healthy, less able in their older years.
Perhaps because they're more accepting, they're enjoying the moments of life rather than trying to shape the whole thing.
Well, it's a complicated set of studies. There was a series of arguments that maybe, why does it take so long to come to terms with your fragility in your life? And the thought was that, the wisdom of age required changes in your brain, or maybe it was that you need experience and it's like a practical skill that had to be learned. But then these researchers found that when you looked at the terminally ill, who were even quite young, they often had the same signature, that they became less focused on acquisition and public achievement and those kinds of things, and became more focused on a tight, smaller group of people that they wanted to have deeper, more intimate relationships with, be connected to, and have purpose expressed through those kinds of relationships.
So this is a really positive conversation for people to be having. And yet, Carl Watkins, I'm very struck with the fact that what Atul was saying at the moment, most people never see a dead body these days. Historically, I guess people were laid out after they died in houses and so forth. These days, if someone dies in the street, the first thing is a blanket has to be put over them, as if it's a kind of unseeable sight, as if we should never touch or see a dead body at all. And that is a relatively new thing, isn't it?
I think it is, and particularly in working class culture, the dead would be very close at hand. When somebody was struck down, they would be kept at home, and there'd often be ritual around the corpse, which might involve viewing the corpse by neighbours, touching the corpse, might involve kissing the corpse by close relatives.
This was a religious thing as well. It was prayers by the corpse, prayers for the deceased's soul and so forth.
It's a place where religion bleeds into custom, and the body of practice is hallowed by time and passed on down the generations. But this forms a kind of powerful script for dealing with death and for dealing with the dead. And so I suppose while in the past there's an ambition still to push death away, it's much harder to do.
Yes. And Deborah, you were brought up, I think, as a Catholic.
I was, yes.
So was this more familiar to you? Did you see dead bodies as a child?
And in fact, I was talking to my own young adult children, and, I spent not a huge amount of my time, but people would die in the Catholic community, and they would be laid out in the front room. And as a young child, I had not much connection to them, but I would see the body.
Yeah.
My children have never been to a funeral. It's and they're in their 20s and late teens, and that is interesting. And I think the other thing that struck me actually was I was thinking about the social mediation of death on things like Twitter and in the media and things like that. There have been a couple of people who have live tweeted. There was an NPR correspondent in the States who live tweeted his mother's death. There's a very well-known doctor in the UK, Dr. Kate Granger, who is herself terminally ill, who has done a huge amount on Twitter to talk about her fears and her feelings about death and dying as a young person. And we have lots of warnings about graphic images, etc. So we have a very mediated version of death. And I was struck, actually, as Carl was talking, by that phenomenon and what that might tell us, because I think it does tell us people are still curious and want to explore death.
We've had a lot of very prominent people writing about dying. Yeah. I'm thinking of Philip Gould, who wrote that extraordinary book about being in what he called the death zone and so forth. But you've also picked up the case of Ezekiel Emanuel, who's an extraordinary guy in America, who has said in advance, I want to die at 75, I'm going to die at 75, and I'm even going to have my memorial service while I'm still there watching it. And that's caused a lot of upset, hasn't it?
It has. It's very interesting. So it was an essay he wrote for The Atlantic. It was picked up. I thought it was very interesting. He gave lots of reasons why he thought 75 was a great age to die, many of which were to do with what you'd accomplished, but also to do with the fact that perhaps frailty was less likely to have set in, but you'd had a good innings, as it were. And I was quite taken aback because I watched as this unfolded.
Not as taken aback as his relatives.
Indeed. And people saying, well, hang on a minute, this is terrible. You shouldn't. It's not up to you to wish for. There's something quite arrogant about the desire, and that's interesting. That slightly superstitious thing that you get what you're given, and fate will deal you its hand. But also, are you saying lives aren't worth living after 75? And lots of people really feeling quite exercised that their
But
lives
we come
are
back
worth
to this
living.
question of autonomy, because all he's saying is, no, I'm not saying that. I'm saying my life is going to
Indeed.
end at 75. That involves lots of religious controversies, of course.
Yes.
Was he a big figure in American debate, Atul? Are you aware of this guy?
Oh, yes, indeed. He was a senior advisor to Obama on the healthcare reform. His brother, Rahm Emanuel, was the chief of staff.
Oh, he's Rahm Emanuel's brother.
Rahm Emanuel's brother, who then became the mayor of quite the family. And I thought it was a beautiful précis of basically somebody who had missed the big picture, that it summarized the view that the only good life is a healthy and independent one, and missing the fact that we have the potential, even as our bodies may decline, even as some of our faculties may decline. In fact, people live and are capable of good lives in that further phase. And that was the lack of understanding and imagination he had. He missed the research on it, but he also missed the experience of just understanding and talking to people about, what Diana's life can be like when you achieve its potential.
There's a very interesting thing here, as if none of our deaths are quite just our own, that society wants to, and our relatives and society generally, wants to own our deaths in some way. And I guess, again, that goes back a long, long way, Carl. I was really interested in the part of your book, if I may just introduce this briefly, which is that we all understand about the Reformation, the huge shock of the Reformation. What I hadn't realised was that so much of the Reformation was a sense among the Catholic, particularly the Catholic poor, that the reformers were stealing their dead from them, and that involved a huge revolt in the north of England.
There certainly was resistance in the north of England. There's a rising around the community in Seymour, up in Yorkshire near the coast, near Scarborough, that's focused very much on the way in which Protestant reformers are closing down institutions dedicated to the memory of the dead, dedicating to prayer for the dead. And this is part and parcel of the Reformation sweeping away of purgatory, sweeping away that immediate space into which the dead are deposited at the moment of death. So there's a tremendous transformation, a tremendous kind of social revolution around the Reformation, which is a transformation in the way that people think about the dead. That seems to me to be one great revolution in the way that we think about the dead around the Reformation. The other one is probably the one that we're living through now.
Atul, we come back to this question which we started with, which is the medicalisation of death. The fact that far too many people end their lives with a kind of desperate struggle or race by doctors to keep this lung going, keep that artery open, and so forth, when they are in fact dying. What kind of training do you think doctors need to have that they're not getting, and what kind of conversation should doctors be having with people who are in their last phase?
I think this is a really key point. From the interviews and looking at people who are very good at these moments with patients, what I found is that they recognize people have priorities besides just living longer, that the most reliable way to find out what people's priorities are is to ask them. And we don't ask them. And about a third of cancer patients, for example, in one study, only a third, they lived on average 4 months, had a conversation with their doctors and family about what their priorities and goals are for the end of their life. When they had that conversation, that group ended up being less likely to choose the last-ditch effort, less likely to have suffering, die in the hospital at the end of life, more likely to choose hospice for the end, and not only have less suffering, they lived on average equally long or longer
than those who are having desperate medical interventions. That's
right.
Really interesting. But this is also, again, legally very difficult. We have in this country the Liverpool pathway, which was meant to be the last part of life, how you reach your death in hospitals or in hospices. And it's meant to be a sort of merciful idea. But it's become incredibly controversial because when a hospital puts you on the Liverpool pathway, that really is the exit chute. And a lot of people feel that it's pushed too much at families and individuals. Deborah?
I would challenge the idea that it's an exit chute. I think that's how it's become perceived, and that's really unfortunate. There have been problems with the Liverpool Care Pathway, absolutely.
Just explain to people listening exactly what the Liverpool Care Pathway is.
So the Liverpool Care Pathway was developed in Liverpool.
Because listeners, you will come across it. Deborah,
it was developed in Liverpool and drawn on the experience of people working, for example, in palliative care. And it was about ensuring saying that those who were sick and were approaching the end of their life, and only that group, wouldn't receive extraordinary treatments that would be unpleasant or difficult or would seek to sustain life in a way that might compromise dignity and might add to suffering. So it has...
Not too many tubes.
Not too many tubes, an opportunity to keep people... It wasn't about withdrawing care. It was about not putting in place extra treatment, extraordinary treatment, for all sorts of reasons, and there are all sorts of reasons for this. The pathway has become adapted and used in ways that have been problematic. There are problems about who was first deemed to be suitable for the pathway. So what is a dying patient, which is in fact much harder, I think Atul might agree with this, to diagnose. Dying is a very hard thing to diagnose. We are all dying. Some of us are dying more faster than others. So at the point at which someone is dying and therefore suitable became problematic. And also how it was explained, what was meant by it. It's not about withdrawing care. It was about specific treatments. It became a proxy for abandonment and fear.
Yes. And Atul, I mean, one of the problems with the case you make very strongly in this book against the over-medicalisation of the last phase of life is that the human instinct to survive is also very, very strong. And lots of people just want to fight and fight and fight, even if it's against their interests, even if it causes huge amounts of pain and mess and distress. They're determined to go on as long as they possibly can.
Well, if that is what people want, I think we should give them that option. But when you actually probe and ask, what is it that you want to fight for? You ask those questions. What is it that you fear and worry for your future? What are your goals if time is short? What outcomes are unacceptable to you? Then you get bright lines and you understand you're fighting for some other ideas. For example, someone may be fighting for, I want pain control, for one thing. I want the opportunity to be at home for a little while. I want the opportunity to be able to have my brain still intact. So what I discovered...
If I'm sitting in a hospital bed and I'm extremely ill, how do I have these conversations? Who comes and has them? And is there space? I mean, we're talking about the British NHS here, but I'm sure it's fairly similar. Is there space for doctors to come and have those conversations? Are they prepared for them?
I think there must be space. There has to be. It's as much part of your duty of care as treatment.
Hospices are supposed to be places where this happens.
Yes, for many people.
I think probably England is a bit ahead of America in the hospice development.
So I would have thought that was true. This is the home of hospice. This is where it spread to the United States.
And I think the hospice is very often the answer, because there you do talk. And people
but here, interestingly, at this point in the United States, hospice has now become closing in on 50% of the way that the American population dies now. It's been a rapid turnaround in the last 5 years. So that, we were at 80% institutionalized before. Now, as of 2012, it's around 45% who die in hospice, half at home, half in hospice centers. And in England, it is surprisingly not to that phase yet. It hasn't scaled up to that level. But I think, all of our societies in the developed world are having a generation of people who want quality of life, even in that last phase of their time. And I think that shift is beginning to occur.
And of course, part of the conversation we've been talking about in hospices or anywhere else is about what happens after you go through that wall, whether anything happens or not. And I come back to that statistic. Almost half of people believe there is an afterlife. And I'm going to ask Carl Watkins again. You describe lots of kinds of afterlife that people have believed in large numbers throughout our history. And we are now left in this attenuated kind of weird, I don't know, almost pagan version of the afterlife, presumably for some people. If they don't believe in God but they believe in an afterlife, what do they really believe in?
There's an interesting omission in our discussion, I suppose, which is that a lot of what we're talking about is either questions of control, when people should be allowed to, or it should be discussed that medication of somebody in the terminal phase of their life should end, or we're considering ways in which people might best preserve autonomy in great old age and continue living in that last phase of life. So we're almost talking here not about a modern art of dying, we're talking about a modern art of living right until the end of life.
Yes.
But we come back to a group who Diana's mentioned already, which is that group of people who are terrified about the thought of death. Don't
want to have the conversation.
Don't want to have that conversation, even if they are by any measurable means at the end of life. And that group seems to me to be a group that we don't really want to talk about in the modern world.
Because we've got nothing to say.
We've got nothing to say. That's a conversation we can't have.
That's very interesting. And there's another group, I guess, which we really haven't mentioned the word dementia much in this conversation at all. And yet there's an awful lot of people with whom those very important conversations really can't take place properly because they have severe dementia, which suggests that we have to have earlier conversations. Diana was talking about thinking about death for 15 minutes every day of your life, but probably many of us have to have conversations about death relatively early on before dementia may set in and make it harder for us.
One of my colleagues' fathers told her, if I can eat chocolate ice cream and watch football on television, that will be good enough for me. And that guided them as his own condition declined over time about what mattered to him. This was a professor, but he would be happy with that diminished life if he could still have a few of those capacities. That said, even people with dementia, we assume that they can't express joy, they can't express things that they want. And I tell the story of a woman named Ruth Barrett who had lost 30 years of her life. She still thought she was 55 years old. She doesn't even remember her most recent husband. But every day, she expresses what brings her joy and what gives her purpose. She loves her friends and being connected to people. She loves an outing. And so the home she was in would arrange for her to be able to go to a restaurant with her friends once a week when she wanted. And they would triple up on the diapers and let her have a margarita. I mean, those are all so against the rules and what you don't allow for people. But they saw that this was, even for her, a source of joy, a source of life, and it allowed them to reduce, medications and things that you use to control the cognitively impaired person.
Well, the coffee is terrible. This is the BBC, but we've been having our own Death Cafe, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Perhaps surprisingly, I have very much indeed. Thank you to all my guests. Atul Gawande, author of Being Mortal, to Deborah Bowman, Carl Watkins, whose book is The Undiscovered Country, and of course to our own wonderful Diana Athill. Thank you all very much indeed. Atul Gawande's Wreath Lectures start on Radio 4 on Tuesday the 25th of November at 9 a.m, and they're also broadcast on the World Service. Next week, join Tom Sutcliffe, who will be discussing self-portrait and identity. But for now, thank you and goodbye.
That it's not a cult of the young, it's a cult of the independent self. And then when you are no longer able to fully care for yourself, we put you in institutions. It is in old age homes or in hospitals. And there we say, you know what is most important? Your safety and your health. Instead of understanding that people have priorities much larger than that, priorities besides just being safe and living longer no matter what.
Absolutely, and I want to come on to those priorities because you have done a kind of journey around the hospitals, the hospices and the nursing homes and all different kinds across America, asking what people want. And a lot of people will end up actually in a hospital bed, not the right place to die because you're surrounded by noise and other people and lots of terrible food and so forth. And we've all seen people, most of us have seen people in that situation. But we also have nursing homes, which are often rather militarised almost. You're ordered around, you're told when you can eat, you're told what you can and you cannot do. So you've come across much better places for the old to be in America. Can you describe a couple of them? I'm thinking, first of all, about the one which introduces animals and children into the living space.
Yeah, completely fascinating. When people have priorities, one of those priorities is that they want to have purpose. They want to know that they're doing more than just existing. And this was a nursing home in upstate New York that they said, we're going to apply for relief from the regulations around safety to allow the nursing home residents to own their own pets. And in fact, they introduced 4 dogs, 2 cats, and 100 parakeets. Decided that when it comes to mortality, it's to be treated like any other condition that the doctors take care of. We went from the 1950s where most death occurred in the home to where today the 80% occurs in institutions, mostly in hospitals. And we've turned it over to people like me who actually don't know a lot about how to guide people through that final phase of their life.
Now, you say in the book, you contrast what happens in modern America, and I think modern Britain's probably very similar in this regard, with the way that your grandfather died in India. Tell us a little bit about that and why you think he had a better death than many of us face today.
So he died at 110 years old.
Good start.
He had 20 years of his life that he probably needed, around-the-clock help. He needed help bathing. He needed help dressing. He had some confusions at times, but he really was someone who nonetheless sat at the head of the table in the family home. People revered him. They came to him for business advice. They came to him for advice on marriages. And he insisted on continuing to patrol his 200 acres of land. His sons would help him. They got a smaller horse for him in order for him to be able to make it safely around the fields. It was the kind of death, aging and then death that we're nostalgic for. As it happens, he died falling off a bus. He insisted on continuing to work and hit his head.
But he was surrounded by a kind of vigorous conversational society.
And everybody was distributed. Anybody who wanted could have their own pets. It required lifting heaven and earth. It required figuring out how the nurses came to battle and the aides came to battle over who was going to clean up the dog poop on the floor, because if a resident couldn't lean over to get it. But the residents who began to have something to care for, they suddenly came alive. They were not plagued by what the doctor there called the 3 plagues of boredom, loneliness, and helplessness. Their need for antidepressants, anti-anxiolytics, antipsychotics dropped, and survival actually increased.
Because a bit like your grandfather, they were surrounded by caring for other people and a kind of multi-sided world which was kind of colourful and energetic.
That's
even
right.
though it was animals, not relatives.
Correct. They had, so people have loyalties. They have things that they live for that are bigger than themselves. They may be as simple as a pet or a family. It may be as complex as wanting to contribute to a political debate or to write a book like Diana Athill, or wanting to be devoted to God. People have, bigger goals.
A bigger cause.
Yeah.
Diana, reading this book, and I know you've reviewed it, how does it compare to the care home that you're in at the moment?
Well, I was delighted to find out, as I read, that my care home that I'm in was almost your ideal. We don't have pets, and I think that dogs are going too far because...
Good morning. A little while ago, I was sitting outside my favourite pub, and we were talking about the number of regulars who died suddenly quite recently, and I expressed a certain amount of unease, and one of them turned to me and said, "It's all right," he said, "the laughing lady has passed over for now." It wasn't an expression I'd heard before, but historically we have always personified death as our inevitable visitor, remorselessly lingering, sometimes merciful, not necessarily feared. In Being Mortal, a book that's caused more conversation than any I can remember for many months, the surgeon, writer and this year's Wreath lecturer, Atul Gawande, has been reflecting on how we treat the very old and how we meet our deaths in this perhaps over-medicalised world. Approaching the laughing lady from a very different direction in his The Undiscovered Country, Carl Watkins has tramped Britain, looking at how we have dealt with death through the centuries. To help our conversation, I'm also joined by Deborah Bowman, Professor of Bioethics and Medical Law at St George's, University of London, and by the writer and favourite of this programme, Diana Athill, who was born in 1917 and is not dead yet. We're going to be asking what makes a good death, and thinking about the persistence of a belief in the afterlife in the modern world. Atul, if I can begin with you. This is a book which covers all sorts of ways of death and old age, but your big theme is that we have over-medicalised death. Can you explain that to us?
Well, so at the basic level, it's that we've decided...
He was engaged in other generations the whole time, and that probably was the reason that it was such a good ending for him. Yes. Whereas most of us now will end our lives in hospital, and yet if you ask people where they want to die, very few people say hospital. So why does that happen? Why are we forced into hospitals?
Well, a couple of things. It's even falling apart in India now. So the multi-generational family worked in part because it enslaved the young women who were expected to live their lives around what would happen to the grandfather or the father. But then also, imagine the sons of my grandfather who lived to 80 still waiting to inherit their land. As soon as we had...
like Prince Charles here, yes.
As soon as we got pensions, we actually moved apart. The older folks did not want to live under the sons and daughters' rules. The sons and daughters didn't want to live under the parents' rules. And so we made an ideal that a good life is the healthy and independent life but we had no plan for what happens when you're not healthy and not independent. And we said, well, guess what? Medicine will take care of that.
So, in a sense, it's the selfishness of the not old pushing the old into nursing homes and then into hospitals for their own reasons that's the problem.
Well, it's a mutual selfishness. Part of what I'm implying is that, as soon as we had the economic means, as we got older, we didn't want to live with the kids and have them taking care of us either, because we suddenly had to be under their rules, and no one wanted that. What we have done is we have said the